Preventing injuries, of course, a super obvious one, but worth mentioning as well. A proper bike fit will minimise your injury risk. So whether you currently have any niggles, aches, pains that are either a direct result of riding on the bike currently, or they could be caused by one of the other sports, whether it be swimming or running, or they could be caused by previous injury that you've had in the past that could be non-related to triathlon even. So making sure that you're biomechanically efficient on the bike is super important to make sure that we can prevent or minimise as much as we possibly can the potential for any future injuries. Obviously, when we're training and racing, the last thing we want is to spend time on the sidelines, so the more that we can optimise your opportunity to be fit, healthy, be on the bike, the better. And of course, performance. So what we're after is more comfort, more power, and ideally more aerodynamics. So those are three fundamental things that we obviously ideally would love to shoot for. The reality is that it's very hard to achieve all three at the same time. Normally you're going to sacrifice one for the other two. So you can imagine this, if we get you more comfortable and we get you more powerful on the bike, very unlikely that that's going to come at the benefit of your aerodynamics. Similarly though, if we were to, let's say, get you more aerodynamic and maybe more comfortable, that could potentially have an impact on your power. Does that make sense? So it's a bit tricky to aim for all three. It's not to say that we don't try to achieve that, but it's also important to, I suppose, take baby steps and make sure that we're kind of ticking the biggest boxes first. And as I said initially, for most people, the first one's comfort, and that's the one that we prioritize. Road bikes versus triathlon and TT bikes. I use triathlon TT bikes interchangeably. This is probably, in terms of like if I was fielding questions from people, this is probably one of the most common questions I would get. So just quick show of hands, who's currently doing their tri training and racing on a road bike? Cool, so a few of you. And how many of you might have clip-ons with your road bike? Already? Cool. So fundamentally, I'll come back to this. Fundamentally, the difference between a road bike and a triathlon bike is really the geometry. So without being too boring here, a triathlon bike is a steeper, what we call seat tube angle, and essentially what that means is we can get your saddle further forward over the bottom bracket, and what that means is it allows you to get your hips further forward over the bottom bracket, and on a triathlon bike you can therefore lower the front end, become a bit more aerodynamic in that front end, and achieve that nice aerodynamic body position as demonstrated here. Now, when you have a road bike with clip-ons, this is a little bit harder to achieve. A road bike, the geometry is generally closer to about that 72, 73 degree seat tube angle or so, which essentially means your saddle is further back behind the bottom bracket. So when you then pop your clip-ons onto your road bike handlebars and you come down into your clip-ons, what happens is because your hips are further back behind the bottom bracket, is you close off your hip angle over the top of the pedal stroke. So that can obviously be a little bit less comfortable than having your hip angle open by being further forward over the bottom bracket. So fundamentally, if anyone was ever saying what's the big benefit that I might see from going to a road bike to going to a triathlon bike, it's the geometry difference that I would say is the biggest win, really. Now, is a road bike with clip-ons the best? Because sometimes people think, well, if I have one bike, then I want it to be versatile. I want to be able to ride my road bike and maybe jump into triathlon training and be able to race on that as well. It becomes a bit of like a hybrid setup, like a jack of all trades. Is it the master of none? I think that's a little bit harsh to say because obviously you can just take your clip-ons off and then you've got a perfectly great road bike setup. But as I said, there are fit implications to be aware of when you have a road bike. The ultimate scenario, eventually, is N+1. So having both. How many have both? Yeah. You know. So the aerodynamics, this is another part to be aware of. Now actually in today's world, with the prevalence of aero road bikes, this is less of a factor than it might have been kind of 10 plus years ago when most road bikes were more traditionally rounded and they didn't pay so much attention to aerodynamics. The trickle down kind of effect of aerodynamics towards road bike frames is, I mean, like you guys will know, it's been massive. So you will generally see road bikes that are far more aerodynamic now than they ever used to be. So you're going to lose out less if you like being on a road bike from an aerodynamic standpoint than you might have done had we been racing 10, 15, 20 years ago. But that being said, the aerodynamic properties of a TT bike will almost always win out. And so if someone says, flat out, I want the fastest bike for me, what's that going to be? Is it going to be a road bike? Is it going to be with clip-ons, or is it going to be a TT bike? It's going to be a TT bike. Adapting to your position. So, like it's right here, this can take time. Be patient, build sensibly and progressively to allow adaptation. So when we see professionals out riding and we see their still shots and you see them in the most perfect aerodynamic position, their head position is awesome, everything's tucked in nicely and they look brilliant on the bike, that is not something that happens overnight. And again, it might seem very obvious to say, but that happens from years and years, and sometimes for them decades of adaptation and gradually building to be able to manage, essentially, an aerodynamic position such as that. So I like to think of training your position in a similar way to how you actually might train. So let's say, for example, you come out of your off season and you start getting into intervals, and you might start with some short intervals, I hope, rather than jumping straight into super long intervals. Think of adapting to your position in the same way. So when you're starting to spend time in the bars, and maybe you haven't spent time in the bars for a fair while, maybe break it up into short intervals where you might do, let's just say like 5 by 3 minutes with like 2 or 3 minute break in between where you can sit up. And then over the weeks and over the months, be progressing that to the point where as you're approaching your key races, you're a lot more comfortable for your long sustained intervals, which might obviously be getting in and around race effort, holding your race position. So that's a really important thing, I think, is to have realistic expectations when you're starting out, when you have a new position. It's very unlikely that you're going to jump on it straight away and just go, wow, amazing, I can sit here all day, happy days, especially when we're training for long distances. Having that ability to be aware that it does take time and it is a process, I think is important, and then at least you're kind of on board with that, and hopefully you don't, as I said, kind of have unrealistic expectations. Should we mimic the pros? Yes and no, I suppose is the answer to that. There's a lot of things that we can learn from the pros in terms of like looking at their setup and trying to mimic maybe some of the fundamental body positions that they might have. But as I said, a lot of the time, it's not quite as simple as just saying, okay, this is approximately what their saddle to pad drop is, this is where their elbow pad width is, this is their forearm angle, this is their head position, I'm just going to set myself up like that and get used to it. You can give it a go, like for sure, and it's not to say that it won't work, but as I said, ideally progressing over time to a position that is going to be suitable and sustainable for you as an individual is the most important thing. And just a note here, like, which ties into this side of things, when should you get a bike fit, or when is the most ideal time to get a bike fit? If you're feeling really uncomfortable on the bike, then obviously sooner rather than later is always going to be good. But in general sense, what I would say is ideally you do it kind of early in your training phase, your preparation phase. So like off season can be a really good time to do it, or just when you're coming out of off season, getting into like the start of your prep for the following season. That's probably the most ideal time, because again, you're kind of starting your training, as I said, in a similar way to how you can then adapt to your new position on the bike. I have had bike fits on race week with people doing 70.3s and Ironman, so like it's not unheard of, but you don't obviously then have a long time to be able to adapt to those changes and to get ready for your race and have the confidence that you're going to be comfortable in that position. So that's just something to be aware of when it comes to like season planning. So body position and aerodynamics. So taking the next step here from Aero Coach. So your body position accounts for approximately 80% of the overall aerodynamic drag of you riding on the bike. So that leaves approximately 20% for the rest of the stuff, which is the bike, your components, hydration, and all that stuff. So obviously it makes sense then with us, the rider, being 80%, it makes sense that we want to optimize that 80% as much as possible. The important thing is that does not mean we just neglect the 20%, because paying attention to all the other stuff still matters. It still accumulates and obviously can contribute to improving our performance. However, that is where we have the big opportunity to improve our overall aerodynamics by improving our body position on the bike. So, as you can probably read this, but small reduction in aerodynamic drag can have a large impact on your race performance. So a rider racing 40 Ks in 1 hour will reduce their time by about 30 seconds for just a 2% reduction in their coefficient of drag. So 30 seconds over 1 hour, okay, yeah, whatever, not very much, no big deal, I can probably give that up. But that's for just a 2% reduction. That's minuscule. Professionals go in to the wind tunnel and they come out with significantly more than that on repeat visits to the wind tunnel. So the potential for troopers to be able to find significant aerodynamic gains through their bike position is really significant. And obviously that's different for every individual, and it depends where your baseline position is, but it's definitely not something to be scoffed at, especially when you consider how hard you train and all the, the grueling training sessions that you do is all about getting you faster and getting you to the finish line quicker. If you can consider that potentially optimizing your position on the bike can help you get there quicker, that's a big win, I reckon. So some of the key considerations that we have, in terms of fit, like I said, one of the most important things is going to be your actual saddle choice. And sometimes this does come down to trial and error, as I said, and trying a few different things and seeing what works well for you and seeing what doesn't. As I said, when we're looking at road bikes with clip-ons versus TT bikes, generally speaking, I would still say a TT triathlon specific saddle will be better suited because it does allow us to get a little bit further forward, open up our hip angle a little bit more, whereas a more traditional road shape saddle typically makes that a little bit more challenging for us. Saddle height from a fit standpoint is super important as well. So one of the things that we see which is relatively common in triathletes is tightness through the hamstrings. So with that in mind, making sure that you're not on a saddle height that's too high for you is really important. Because if you can imagine, every time you're pushing through the bottom of the pedal stroke through 6 o'clock, if you're putting your hamstrings on stretch and overextending your leg more than your hamstrings naturally want to go, one, it's going to be a potential injury risk for you, and it's also going to rob you of your potential for power output as well, both for your maximum power output and your sustained power output. So making sure your saddle height is appropriate for you is really important too. Hip angle is another one from a fit standpoint. That is really important. As I said, for triathletes in our aerodynamic position, hip injuries are relatively common. So what we want to do is making sure, again, as I said before, when you're coming over 12 o'clock over the top of the pedal stroke, as much as possible, keeping that hip angle open. So a more open hip angle is always going to be more comfortable for us, and it's almost always going to enable us to achieve higher power as opposed to having a hip angle that is a little bit more closed off. The flip side of that is that sometimes when we do have a more closed off hip angle, it can be because we've achieved or are looking to achieve a more aerodynamic position. So of course there is a potential where we could be in a situation where your power output comes down, but your aerodynamics improves, and the net result is that you are faster. So that sounds good. However, if it puts your body in a position where you're susceptible to injury, I would therefore say not good. Does that make sense? One of the best, has anyone heard of or paid much attention to the kind of short crank craze that you might have heard a little bit about? So short cranks, as a fitter, one of the best tools that I have available to be able to help open up somebody's hip angle on the triathlon bike. Essentially what it does is it allows us to increase your saddle height relative to your crank length, obviously, and then over the top of the pedal stroke it opens up your hip angle significantly as well. So if you are an athlete who has a history of hip discomfort or maybe hip injury or just general hip tightness, then short cranks are definitely something that could potentially be a big game changer for you and really lead to improved comfort on the bike. It wasn't too long ago, I say too long ago, maybe like 20 odd years ago, like 175mm cranks were pretty stock standard on TT bikes. You'd see, like Jake can probably remember as well, like 180s on some TT bikes as well. I'm sure you've serviced a few bikes that probably had, maybe still do. Short cranks used to be a bit weird, and nobody used to kind of get behind them or really adopt to them. But more recently now, shorter cranks are exceedingly common, whereas it wasn't probably up to about 10 years ago, manufacturers mostly wouldn't create and actually make cranks shorter than 165mm, whereas now mainstream manufacturers like SRAM and Shimano do go down to 160, and then you've got brands like Rota who go down to 150, then you've got custom brands who will go like below 150, like John Cobb and stuff do like 140s, 145s. So there's lots of more options out there. Some of them are a bit more bespoke, but even your kind of mainstream manufacturers are kind of realizing that short cranks are something that are here to stay, essentially. So this is a good example of something where it would be good not to mimic maybe like what you see in the Tour de France as a good option, or as a good example rather. 175 and 180 cranks in the Tour de France like in the early 2000s, like 2010 would have been stock standard on most of the bikes there. Whereas now you'll see a lot of them with like 170s and some of them down to 165s as well. Aerodynamics as a consideration. Now, obviously, this is like the slightly more exciting part. Head position, really, really crucial, obviously, for our overall aerodynamics, and it's obvious to say that the lower, generally speaking, we can get our head position, and the more we can get our head out of the way, the faster that is going to be. Torso angle, of course, is very important as well. We want to kind of get our torso ideally as low as we're able to be able to improve and increase our aerodynamics. But that, again, is going to be a function of our fit considerations. So it's not just, again, as simple as saying, okay, cool, I know torso angle is important, therefore I'm going to set myself up low enough in the front end to make sure I'm getting my torso close to kind of parallel to the top tube. You kind of want to make sure you're getting the fit considerations right first, but within that, we do want to get our torso angle a little bit lower to be more aerodynamic if we can. Elbow and shoulder width. This is really important when it comes to our frontal area. So if you can imagine having our arm pads wider, obviously we create our arms wider. That is almost always going to be a little bit slower than bringing our elbows in. The flip side of that, of course, is that as we become narrower with our elbow pad position, generally speaking, it's going to become less comfortable. However, elbow pad width is something that I find is highly trainable and something that you can adapt to, but it can be quite uncomfortable at the start, and it can be something that you kind of initially might go, nah, that's not for me, I just will start wider, and that's absolutely fine. What I would say is always choose an elbow pad width that feels comfortable for you. That is fundamentally important, and the reason is because of shoulder width. Shoulder width itself, from an aerodynamic standpoint, is more important on reducing your overall coefficient of drag than the elbow width alone. And what I personally find, and you might find this if you kind of think about it going forward, is that when you have your elbows a fraction wider, it actually becomes easier to roll your shoulders in and make your shoulder profile a little bit narrower, as opposed to when you have your elbows very narrow, it becomes then quite hard to actually roll your shoulders in. It's almost like you don't have much more room for maneuver. And I've personally, at least speaking from my own personal experience, I've personally noticed that bringing my shoulder width in has a far better improvement on my overall aerodynamics than bringing my elbows in alone does. So that's something that lots of people, I think, miss. They often see arm pad width and think, cool, okay, narrow is faster, let's try and get used to narrower, but don't think or pay any attention to what's happening up here. So that's definitely something to be aware of and have a think about maybe when you're on your bikes next time. Think about kind of where your shoulders naturally land. Some people also kind of just flare their shoulders out, and again, if that's kind of natural to you, then just see if that's something that you can work on gradually. Coming back to that previous slide where we're talking about like a 2% improvement in aerodynamics, the difference between you having your shoulders flared out versus being able to facilitate rolling your shoulders in slightly would be massive, like really, really significant. So finding an elbow pad position that works for you to achieve that will be well worthwhile. Forearm angle as well. This is something that, again, very, very important. This picture here is give or take 2012, I think. Relatively flat forearm angle, which was pretty common at the time. Nowadays, you probably see a lot more kind of like 10 to 15 degree forearm angles. Sometimes you see more of this, what we call like a praying mantis position, where you get a little bit higher. Generally speaking, my kind of recommendation for most people is to find something that falls in and around that kind of 10 to 15 degree forearm angle. That's very safe aerodynamically and from a comfort standpoint as well. A forearm angle where we're parallel to the ground, generally speaking, will not quite be as fast as a forearm angle that's slightly higher, around that 10 to 15 degrees. As we come beyond 15 degrees, closer to that kind of 20, 25, 30, this is in the realm of the unknown. So it could be quicker, it could be slower, and the only way you're going to know thoroughly is by doing very diligent field testing or wind tunnel testing. And so generally my recommendation to people is we just don't go beyond that kind of 10 to 15 where you know you're safe. Cool. So bike position is dynamic. So if you just looked at these two photos, which are obviously side by side, you would instantly probably assume that something has changed on the bike and her bike setup has kind of changed mid-race. Whereas actually nothing has changed. This is a picture from the same race, same bike, same setup, same rider. This is a great illustration of how you can change your body position on the bike without actually changing a single thing on your bike. So the way that you ride your bike can differ in the race. And whether you're racing the 70.3 or whether you're racing the Ironman, 90 or 180 k's is a long way, and it's pretty unrealistic to expect you to hold the exact same position for the entirety of the time. So understanding and being aware that you can have variations in the way you hold your body position on the bike, I think it's really key, and lots of people, I think, almost feel better when I tell them that, because they kind of think, oh no, I should hold my position, and if I get out of my position it means I'm not doing well or something's not right. But actually understanding that you can have these variations depending on the specific moment in the race. For example, if you're going into a headwind versus going into a tailwind, if you're carrying good speed or if you're not, if you're sitting behind a group and maybe your power's a little bit lower than you're forecasting, or if you're trying to, for whatever reason, kind of increase your power at different times. These are all reasons and I suppose examples of how you might vary your position on the bike, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with having the ability to change your position slightly. So if I was totally kind of guessing, because obviously I have no inside knowledge as to the reasoning behind this, or even I don't know what part of the course this is, I would assume this position might be one where this rider is riding with a strong tailwind, for example, and she's really trying to optimize her speed, and probably feels, as you can see, she's moved her hips a lot further back over the saddle compared to this picture on the left, probably feels that she's able to maintain really good control of the bike at that high speed, but also really optimize getting her head position a lot lower than the position on the left as well. So when I saw that, I thought it was a really interesting photo, but that might just be me. This is like probably the more exciting one. So equipment considerations. So like this is the stuff that we all obviously froth on as triathletes. So these are some of the things that are going to make a difference one way or the other to your aerodynamics and therefore your overall time. So we've got bike frame, wheels, tires, your hydration placement, and your spares as well. I'll pop that in. Your helmet, your clothing, drivetrain efficiency, and your bearings. There's probably some that I've missed as well, but these were the initial ones that kind of sprung to mind. So this might be